The morning it all started, I was sipping my coffee on the porch, enjoying the cool breeze and watching the sunlight filter through the tall oak tree that stood proudly in my front yard. The very tree that had been planted by my grandfather decades ago and had grown into a towering symbol of family history, shade, and beauty. I loved that tree more than most things in the yard, and it wasn't just sentimental value. It was a part of the property, providing natural cooling, a home for birds, and a place where my kids had hung swings when they were little. But little did I know that someone else, particularly the one person in the neighborhood who had been nothing but a nightmare since the day I moved in, had set her sights on it with no intention of asking permission or even considering the consequences. Before I dive into the story, let me say this. What happened after is something you wouldn't believe unless you heard it step by step, because it involves arrogance, control, and ultimately karma striking in the most dramatic way possible. And if you enjoy stories where HOA bullies finally get what they deserve, make sure you stick around until the end, because this one is going to leave you shocked. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to Sham Stories so you never miss another jaw-dropping tale like this one. Now, back to the story. Our HOA had always been difficult, but ever since Karen became president, things had gone from bad to unbearable. She was the kind of woman who strutted around the neighborhood with a clipboard, jotting down notes, snapping pictures of houses, and then sending out violation letters as if it were her personal mission to make everyone miserable. Her favorite phrase was community standards, and she wielded those words like a weapon to control even the tiniest details of people's lives. Whether it was the color of a front door, the type of mailbox, or the length of grass, Karen had something to say, and her voice was always dripping with condescension. I had clashed with her before, mostly over petty things like leaving my trash can out a few hours too long or having my porch light a little too bright for her liking. But I never thought she would target my tree. It started subtly. One day she left a note in my mailbox claiming that the oak tree was an eyesore because its branches extended slightly over the sidewalk. I laughed when I read it because the tree was perfectly healthy and trimmed. I had even hired an arborist a few months earlier to make sure it was safe and well maintained. The arborist had told me it was one of the strongest trees he'd seen and posed no risk to anyone. But of course, logic wasn't something Karen cared about. The following week, she confronted me in person while I was raking leaves. "That tree of yours is a liability," she snapped, tapping her clipboard like it gave her authority over my property. "If it falls, it'll damage homes or hurt someone. And as HOA president, I can't allow that risk." I told her politely that the tree was fine. I had documentation from a professional. I even offered to show her the report, but she waved me off. "We'll see about that," she muttered before storming off. From that moment, I knew she was plotting something. Karen wasn't the type to let things go. Over the next few weeks, I noticed her stopping in front of my house more often, glaring at the tree as though it had personally insulted her. Neighbors mentioned that she had started talking about unsightly landscaping during HOA meetings. And while she didn't name me outright, it was obvious who she was referring to. Then came the day that changed everything. I wasn't home that morning, had gone to the hardware store to pick up supplies for a project, when Karen decided to take matters into her own hands. Without notifying me, without getting approval from the city, and without any legitimate reason, she hired a crew to come and cut down the oak tree. She must have thought she was being clever, sneaking behind my back and using HOA funds to pay for it, because when I pulled into the driveway, I saw a group of workers already sawing through the massive branches. I slammed on the brakes, jumped out of my truck, and shouted at them to stop immediately. The workers looked confused, but they were just following orders. They told me that the HOA president said, "This tree is dangerous," and ordered its removal. My blood boiled. I turned to see Karen standing smugly on the sidewalk, arms crossed, smirking like she had finally won. "You should be thanking me," she said. "I'm saving you from a lawsuit and improving the look of the neighborhood." I couldn't believe the audacity. I told her she had no right to do this, that the tree was on my private property, and I had never given permission. She just shrugged and said, "The HOA has authority over community safety." At that point, I was ready to call the police. But before I could, fate stepped in. The workers, already deep into the cutting, made a critical mistake. Instead of securing the massive trunk and guiding it properly, They followed Karen's rushed instructions to just get rid of it quickly. I watched in horror as the chainsaw buzzed through the thick wood, the tree groaning as it began to fall. But instead of collapsing harmlessly into my yard like they expected, the oak tree twisted mid-fall, its enormous weight pulling it directly toward Karen's house across the street. I'll never forget the look on her face as her smug grin turned to wide-eyed panic. Within seconds, the tree crashed down with a thunderous boom, smashing through her roof, shattering windows, and splintering walls like they were made of paper. The ground shook under my feet, and a cloud of dust and debris rose into the air. Neighbors came running out of their homes, gasping at the sight. Some covered their mouths in shock, others whispered about karma. But everyone knew this was a disaster entirely of Karen's own making. She screamed, clutching her head as she realized the damage done to her precious home, the one she always bragged about as the best maintained in the community. The workers stood frozen, unsure of what to do. I, on the other hand, pulled out my phone and called the police. When the officers arrived, it didn't take long for the truth to unravel. I showed them the arborist's report proving the tree was healthy, explained that Karen had ordered the removal without my consent, and pointed out the obvious fact that the tree fell on her own property, not mine. The officers listened carefully, took statements from the workers and neighbors, and finally turned to Karen, who was now hysterical, demanding that I be fined for endangering the neighborhood, but the officers weren't buying it. One of them shook his head and said, "Ma'am, from everything we're hearing, you had no authority to cut this tree, and now you've caused significant property damage to your own home. You'll need to take this up in court." Karen's face turned beet red, her arrogance replaced with disbelief. She kept insisting that as HOA president, she had the final say. But the officers made it clear that HOA rules do not override property rights. In fact, by using HOA funds without approval to pay for the workers, she may have committed fraud. That realization made her go silent for the first time in her life. Meanwhile, I stood there, a mix of relief and satisfaction washing over me. The tree may have been gone, but the justice of seeing it land on her house instead of mine was priceless. What happened next only escalated the situation, leading to one of the biggest HOA scandals our neighborhood had ever seen.
Oh.
And trust me, you'll want to hear every detail. The days following the incident with the oak tree were some of the most chaotic and surreal I had ever experienced in the neighborhood. Word spread faster than wildfire by the end of that same day. Nearly everyone in the subdivision had either seen the damage firsthand or heard about it from someone else. The giant oak that Karen had insisted was a danger to the community had demolished her own house, leaving her roof caved in, her upper floor unlivable, and her front yard buried under splintered wood and debris. To make matters worse, the sound of hammers and saws was replaced with sirens, because within hours, insurance investigators, city code enforcement officers, and police were all swarming the scene. I knew this wasn't going to be a simple matter of her blaming me and moving on this. It was the kind of incident that unraveled a whole mess of lies. Abuses of power, and eventually legal trouble she never saw coming. The morning after the crash, I woke up to the sound of trucks outside. Karen had apparently tried to hire an emergency cleanup crew to start removing the debris, but the city inspector halted everything as soon as he arrived. He told her she couldn't touch anything until a full investigation was conducted. That didn't sit well with Karen, and I could hear her screeching from across the street, demanding special treatment because she was the president of the HOA. The inspector didn't flinch. He looked her square in the eye and said, "Ma'am, I don't care if you're the president of the United States. You caused this, and now you're going to answer for it." Watching her deflate in front of the entire neighborhood was oddly satisfying. But while her home lay in ruins, Karen wasn't about to give up her crusade. That afternoon, I received a notice taped to my front door. In it, she accused me of negligence, claiming that despite her repeated warnings, I had failed to address the dangerous condition of the oak tree, which had resulted in catastrophic property damage. She threatened to fine me $5,000 for violating HOA standards, and announced that the HOA would be holding an emergency board meeting to determine appropriate consequences. I laughed so hard when I read it, I nearly fell off my porch. She was delusional. Not only had she orchestrated the entire removal behind my back, but she also used HOA funds without authorization, which I had proof of thanks to one of the workers' receipts showing her signature. I didn't waste any time. I made copies of the arborist's report, the receipt, even gathered statements from neighbors who had witnessed the whole thing. By the time the emergency HOA meeting rolled around, I was more than ready. The meeting was held in the community clubhouse. It was packed. More residents showed up than I had ever seen at any meeting before. Everyone wanted to see the showdown. Karen sat at the front of the room, her usual smugness replaced by a brittle kind of determination, so she could still bully her way through. The moment she opened the meeting, she launched into a dramatic speech about the dangers of neglectful homeowners, how the HOA must act decisively to prevent further disasters. She pointed directly at me and declared that my negligence had endangered the entire community. But before she could even finish, I stood up and handed the documents to the other board members. "Here's the arborist's report," I said loudly enough for the entire room to hear. "It clearly states the tree was perfectly healthy. And here's proof that Karen hired the workers without my permission." Using HOA money that none of you approved, gasps rippled through the room as I held up the receipt. Karen's face turned pale and she tried to stammer out a response, but the damage was already done. Another neighbor stood up and shouted, "We all saw what happened. That tree was fine until she had it cut, and it landed on her house, not his." The room erupted with chatter, people whispering and nodding in agreement. The other board members looked furious not at me, but at Karen. One of them, the usually quiet man named George, finally spoke up. "Karen, is this true? Did you authorize this on your own?" Karen tried to spin it, saying she was acting in the best interest of the neighborhood, but George shook his head. "That's not how this works. You can't just use funds without approval and destroy someone's property." The meeting quickly devolved into shouting, the Karen desperately trying to regain control, but no one was buying it anymore. By the end of the night, the board had voted to suspend her powers pending a full investigation. For the first time in years, Karen's iron grip on the HOA was slipping and everyone could feel it. But that was just the beginning. Over the next week, the fallout grew worse for her. Her insurance company came out to assess the damage and quickly discovered that the tree had been intentionally cut down without the homeowner's consent. Because of that, they denied her claim entirely, stating that the damage was self-inflicted. That left her staring at repair costs in the hundreds of thousands of dollars with no help in sight. To make matters worse, residents began digging into the HOA's finances, and what they found was shocking. Karen had been misusing funds for years, charging administrative fees that mysteriously went into her personal account, hiring her relatives for unnecessary maintenance jobs, and even expensing luxury dinners under the guise of board meetings. It was like a dam had broken, and everything she had been hiding was spilling out at once. Meanwhile, I was careful to keep my head down and let the process play out. Neighbors I barely knew started stopping by my house to thank me for standing up to her, telling me how relieved they were that someone had finally exposed her corruption. For years, people had been too afraid to challenge her, fearing fines or retaliation, but now they saw she wasn't invincible. She was crumbling under the weight of her own arrogance. Still, Karen didn't go down quietly. She started sending out long, rambling emails to the entire community, painting herself as a victim and accusing me of leading a witch hunt against her. In one email, she even claimed the tree had been sabotaged to fall on her house, which made no sense whatsoever. By that point, most people just rolled their eyes and ignored her. The final straw came when the city launched its own investigation. Because she had ordered the tree removal without the proper permits, and because it resulted in property destruction, she was facing fines and possible criminal charges. I remember watching from my porch as city officials served her with legal papers, her face twisting in outrage as she screamed at them in front of the entire block. She tried to rally support from the few allies she had left, but even they were starting to distance themselves, realizing she was nothing but trouble. The sight of Karen standing in front of her half-demolished house, papers in hand, yelling at city officers while neighbors whispered and recorded with their phones was a picture of downfall. And everyone knew it. What struck me most during that time was how quickly the balance of power shifted. For so long, Karen had terrorized the neighborhood with her rules and threats. But now the same people she had bullied were laughing behind her back, sharing memes in the community group chat, and openly mocking her downfall. One neighbor even joked she wanted shade. Now she's got a whole tree in her living room. While it was funny in a dark way, it also highlighted the deeper truth. People like Karen thrive on fear, but once that fear is gone, their power collapses almost overnight. Despite everything, I almost felt a little sorry for her when I saw her sitting alone on her porch one evening, staring blankly at the wreckage of her home. Almost, but then I remembered. The smug look on her face when she ordered my tree cut down, the arrogance with which she dismissed my rights, and the lies she tried to spread to cover her tracks. No, she had brought this on herself, and karma had delivered it with perfect timing. What came next, however, would push things to a level none of us expected. Because Karen wasn't just facing community backlash anymore. She was about to face real legal consequences that would change her life forever. As the days turned into weeks after the oak tree debacle, the neighborhood seemed to breathe easier for the first time in years. Without Karen patrolling the streets and issuing citations for things like trash cans visible for more than 3 minutes or mailboxes, it's not polished enough, people felt liberated. Kids were riding their bikes freely. Neighbors were chatting without looking over their shoulders, and for once, the community group chat wasn't filled with threats of fines. But just because the neighborhood had relaxed didn't mean Karen had given up. If anything, she was more determined than ever to claw her way back into control, even if that meant dragging everyone else down with her. Karen's house still sat half-crushed under the weight of the fallen oak, blue tarps covering the gaping hole where her roof had once been. Construction crews refused to work for her unless she paid up front, since her insurance had denied her claim. From what neighbors whispered, she was dipping into her personal savings to make temporary repairs, but the cost was bleeding her dry. And yet, instead of showing humility, she doubled down. She started driving around the neighborhood, clipboard in hand, jotting down supposed violations again, even though her HOA authority had been suspended. One neighbor, the Hendersons, told me she'd left them a handwritten note demanding they remove unauthorized lawn ornaments or face fines. When they laughed and tossed the note, she came back the next day and tried to rip the ornaments out of the ground herself. That ended with the Hendersons calling the police, and though no arrests were made, the officers gave Karen a stern warning to stay off other people's property. It was clear she was unraveling, and yet, the more she unraveled, the more dangerous she became. A few nights later, I woke up around midnight to the sound of rustling outside my window. At first, I thought it was raccoons, but when I peeked through the blinds, I nearly lost my breath. There was Karen standing in my yard with a flashlight, pointing it at the stump of the oak tree and muttering to herself. I grabbed my phone and started recording just in time to hear her say he thinks he's won, but I'll prove it was his fault. I'll prove it. When I stepped outside and confronted her, she nearly jumped out of her skin. She tried to spin some nonsense about inspecting a dangerous condition, but when I reminded her she had no authority anymore and that I had her trespassing on video, she scurried off into the night like a guilty thief. The next day, I decided enough was enough. I went down to the police station and filed a formal trespassing complaint. The officer who took my statement was sympathetic, saying they'd had multiple calls about Karen from different neighbors in recent weeks. She wasn't just bothering me, she was showing up uninvited at other people's homes, screaming at them about violations, and even trying to barge into a garage sale to demand they take down unapproved signage. It was like watching someone implode in real time. The officer assured me they'd keep an eye on her and advised me to keep my security cameras running at all times. I already had them, but I added more around the property just to be safe. Meanwhile, the HOA board held another meeting, and this one was even more explosive than the first. With all the financial records laid bare, the extent of Karen's corruption was undeniable. Thousands of dollars had been siphoned off for personal expenses, spa treatments, high-end furniture, even a vacation she had disguised as a leadership conference. Neighbors were furious. People stood up one by one, recounting the fines she had unjustly levied, the threats she had made, and the intimidation tactics she had used to keep everyone in line. George, the quiet board member, summed it up best when he said, "She didn't just abuse her position, she abused every single one of us." by the end of that night, the board voted unanimously to remove her from the HOA presidency permanently and bar her from holding any future position. The room erupted in applause, and for the first time in years, people left smiling. Karen, however, refused to accept it. She stormed out of the meeting halfway through, screaming about how the entire neighborhood was conspiring against her and that she would take everyone down in court. True to her word, a week later, I was served with papers. She was suing me for negligence, defamation, and emotional distress. The lawsuit was laughable, but it still meant I had to hire a lawyer and prepare for a legal battle. My attorney, a sharp woman named Claire, assured me that Karen's case was flimsy at best. She has no evidence, Claire said confidently. If anything, we can countersue for damages and harassment. Still, the idea of going to court with her weighed on me. Karen was unpredictable, and I knew she'd pull every trick she could to make my life miserable. In the weeks leading up to the court date, Karen ramped up her campaign against me. She sent out flyers to the entire neighborhood, calling me a danger to the community and claiming I had deliberately maintained hazardous property. Most people just laughed and threw them away, but a few new residents, who hadn't lived through her tyranny, started asking questions. That was exactly what Karen wanted to sow doubt, to stir up drama, to paint herself as the victim. I responded by calmly sharing the arborist's report, the receipts, and the video evidence of her trespassing. Slowly but surely, the tide of public opinion crushed her lies. Then came the day of the court hearing. The courthouse was buzzing with neighbors who had come to watch, eager to see Karen finally face consequences. She showed up in a gaudy, bright red suit, her hair perfectly styled, acting like she was the star of the show. She strutted into the courtroom with a stack of papers and a smug grin, convinced she was about to destroy me. But as soon as proceedings began, her case fell apart. She had no legitimate evidence, just rants, accusations, and photocopies of her own letters to herself. My lawyer, Claire, shredded her arguments piece by piece, presenting the arborist's report, the unauthorized receipt, and witness statements. By the time Claire was done, even the judge looked annoyed with Karen. When the ruling came down, it was swift and decisive. Case dismissed. Not only that, the judge scolded Karen for wasting the court's time and hinted that sanctions could be coming if she filed any more frivolous lawsuits. The courtroom erupted in whispers, and I felt a wave of relief wash over me. Karen, on the other hand, looked like she'd swallowed a lemon. She stormed out, muttering threats under her breath, but everyone could see if she had lost. For the first time, she wasn't the one calling the shots. That night, the neighborhood felt like it was celebrating. People were out on their porches, clinking glasses and chatting about how justice had finally been served. One neighbor even baked a cake shaped like a tree stump and brought it over as a joke. I couldn't help but laugh. It was the first time I'd felt truly at peace since this whole ordeal began. But even as we celebrated, I had a nagging feeling that Karen wasn't done yet. She was too stubborn, too arrogant to simply accept defeat. And I was right. Because in the days that followed, Karen's behavior spiraled into something even darker, something that would push this entire saga into dangerous new territory. The days after the court ruling should have been peaceful, but Karen was never the kind of person to walk away quietly. Instead of licking her wounds and trying to rebuild what was left of her house, she launched herself into a full-blown vendetta. Every day I could feel her eyes on me. If I stepped outside to mow the lawn, I'd see her sitting in her car across the street, glaring. If I walked down to the mailbox, she'd make a point of stomping out to hers at the same time, muttering loud insults under her breath. She was unraveling, and though most of the neighborhood ignored her, I couldn't shake the sense that she was plotting something far worse than nasty looks. Her house was in shambles, and yet she still managed to project this aura of superiority. She'd invite contractors over, but they would leave after heated arguments about payment. More often than not, I saw her standing in her driveway, screaming into her phone. And when she wasn't fighting with contractors, she was harassing neighbors. The Hendersons told me she accused them of planting their shrubs 2 inches too far into common property. Another neighbor, Maria, said Karen stood outside her home yelling that her wind chimes were unauthorized noise. Pollution. It was as if the court's dismissal had lit a fire under her if she couldn't control the neighborhood through the HOA. She'd try to control it through intimidation. The rest of us weren't having it anymore. After years of tolerating her bullying, people had reached their breaking point. A group of residents, including me, started meeting informally at George's house to talk about how to protect ourselves and keep the neighborhood peaceful. We called it the Anti-Karen Club, half-jokingly, but the conversations were serious. People were afraid she would escalate, and they were right to worry. Because one evening, not long after, Karen crossed another line. I was sitting in my living room when my security cameras pinged an alert. Pulling up the footage on my phone, I saw Karen again, prowling near the stump of the oak tree. But this time, she wasn't just looking. She had a small axe in her hand. She was hacking angrily at the stump, as though punishing it for ruining her life. I couldn't believe what I was seeing. I stepped outside, phone in hand, and shouted, "Karen, what the hell are you doing on my property again?" She froze for a second, then shouted back, "This tree is the reason my house is ruined. It's your fault, and I won't let you get away with it." I reminded her that she had destroyed the tree, not me, and that she was trespassing yet again. She hurled the axe onto the ground and stormed off, but not before I made sure to capture everything on video. The next morning, I marched back down to the police station. This time, they were done giving warnings. With the footage in hand, the officers told me they had enough evidence to press charges for trespassing and vandalism. They issued a citation and promised to deliver it directly to Karen. I didn't see it happen, but I heard from neighbors that she had another spectacular meltdown when the officers showed up. She screamed about conspiracies, corruption, and how everyone was out to get her. But the law was no longer in her favor, and people were no longer afraid. Despite this, Karen tried one more desperate move. A few days later, I received another letter, not from her, but from a lawyer representing her. The letter claimed that the tree had been an attractive nuisance and that I was still liable for the damage to her home. It demanded $250,000 in compensation. My attorney Claire read the letter, laughed, and said, "She's reaching. This won't hold up in court." She drafted a firm response, threatening counterclaims for harassment, legal fees, and defamation if Karen continued. After that, the lawyer representing her mysteriously stopped returning her calls. And from what I gathered, she couldn't afford to retain him any longer. But Karen didn't stop with me. She tried to rally the few supporters she still had left in the neighborhood, mostly newer residents who hadn't yet learned her ways. She held a community meeting in her damaged living room, inviting people with promises of restoring order to the neighborhood. Only a handful showed up, and when they did, they found her ranting about conspiracies, waving around printouts of emails, and showing blurry photos she claimed were proof of sabotage. The meeting ended quickly, with her supporters slipping out one by one, leaving her shouting at an empty room. Neighbors recorded clips of it from outside and posted them in the community group chat, where they became instant memes. The once feared HOA president had become the laughingstock of the neighborhood. Still, I knew better than to underestimate her. People like Karen didn't just fade quietly, they burned out spectacularly. And soon enough, she proved me right. One night, just past midnight, my cameras caught something shocking. Karen, dressed in black clothing, sneaking onto my property again. This time, she was carrying a canister of gasoline. My heart pounded as I watched her pour it near the stump of the oak tree, clearly intending to set it on fire. I didn't waste a second. I called 911. Within minutes, flashing lights lit up the street. Police cars swarmed, and I watched as officers caught Karen red-handed, the gasoline still in her hands. She screamed and kicked, insisting it was all a setup, but the evidence was undeniable. They arrested her on the spot, charging her with attempted arson, trespassing, and destruction of property. The neighborhood woke up to the commotion. Dozens of people stood on their lawns watching as Karen was handcuffed and taken away. The sight of her screaming in the back of a police car was something none of us would ever forget. For years, she had terrorized us with fines and rules, but now she was being hauled off like the criminal she had become. Some neighbors clapped, others just shook their heads in disbelief. But everyone agreed on one thing: Karen's reign of terror was finally over. In the days that followed, the atmosphere in the neighborhood changed completely. People were smiling again, talking openly about their plans for their homes without fear of citations. The HOA board voted to dissolve some of Karen's more ridiculous rules, like the one banning holiday decorations before December or limiting the number of cars in a driveway. It was like a dark cloud had lifted. As for Karen, she was released on bail, but her legal troubles were only beginning. Between the vandalism, the attempted arson, and the financial fraud uncovered in the HOA accounts, she was facing serious charges. Word spread that prosecutors were preparing to make an example out of her. Watching her downfall was surreal. Here was a woman who had once strutted through the neighborhood like a queen, barking orders and threatening fines, now reduced to a pariah, mocked by the very people she used to control. And yet there was still a sense of unease. Karen wasn't gone yet. She was out on bail, and though her power had crumbled, her anger hadn't. Whenever I saw her around, she looked at me with pure venom, as though all her misery was my fault. I knew she blamed me for everything, for the tree, for her house, for her lost status. And though the law was closing in, I couldn't shake the feeling that she might try one last desperate act before it was all over. The fallout from Karen's arrest rippled through the neighborhood like an aftershock. People were relieved, but no one fully trusted that she was finished. It was as if we all expected her to come storming back with even more fury. She still had her house, though half destroyed, and she was still technically a resident, which meant she still lurked in the shadows of our community. The strangest part was that after she was bailed out, she didn't vanish like many expected. Instead, she doubled down on her anger. She became more reclusive, but not silent. From my security cameras, I often caught her pacing her yard, talking to herself, waving her arms, sometimes even screaming in the middle of the night. Neighbors reported hearing banging sounds and strange noises coming from her property. Some whispered that she was losing her mind completely, that the once self-righteous HOA president had slipped into paranoia. But for all her spiraling, Karen still had moments where she struck with precision. One morning, George found his mailbox ripped out of the ground and smashed on his lawn. A week later, Maria discovered someone had spray-painted noise polluter across her garage door. Security cameras later confirmed what we already knew: it was Karen, sneaking around in the middle of the night like a vandal. Police reports were filed, but the system was slow. She always seemed to escape harsher consequences, claiming misunderstandings, making excuses, or simply denying involvement. Yet with every act of spite, her reputation crumbled further. I tried to go about my life, but Karen was never far from my thoughts. Even simple things like taking out the trash or trimming the hedges felt like acts of defiance, because I knew she was watching, waiting for me to make a mistake she could pounce on. The oak tree stump in my yard became a symbol of everything she had destroyed, a daily reminder of how far she had gone. I considered removing it entirely, grinding it down so it wouldn't be there anymore, but something stopped me. That stump wasn't just a tree remnant, it was proof. It was the line she had crossed when she illegally cut down something that wasn't hers, and it marked the beginning of her downfall. The court dates piled up. She was being dragged into hearings for vandalism, trespassing, and the attempted arson. At one point, the prosecutors tried to consolidate everything into one case. But Karen's legal team, what was left of it, kept stalling, filing continuances and objections. It was clear she was running out of money, as she no longer had top-tier lawyers representing her. Instead, shuffled between public defenders and low-level attorneys who couldn't keep up with the sheer volume of evidence stacked against her. Still, every delay meant Karen had more time to stir chaos in the neighborhood. At one point, she tried to rally sympathy. She printed flyers claiming she was the victim of a conspiracy. Neighbors were framing her, that the city was corrupt, and that she was being unfairly persecuted. She dropped them in mailboxes late at night, but no one took her seriously anymore. The neighbors who once respected or feared her now mocked her. Some even started a parody Facebook group called Karen's HOA of One, posting memes and satirical rules like all birds must ask permission before landing in the neighborhood, or residents must pay a $10 fine for smiling too loudly. The group grew fast, and Karen somehow found out. That sent her into another tailspin. One evening, I came home to find eggs thrown all over my front door and driveway. Security cameras caught her again. Was Karen, crouched in the shadows, hurling eggs like a petulant teenager. I turned the footage in, but even when police cited her again, she seemed unfazed. It was as if she thrived on the conflict, feeding off the chaos she created. The more isolated she became, the more desperate her actions grew. Despite her antics, there were moments where she showed cracks in her armor. I once caught her sitting alone on her porch, staring blankly at her ruined house. For a split second, she didn't look like the tyrant who had terrorized us for years. She looked like a woman who had lost everything and couldn't figure out how to get it back. But sympathy was hard to muster when I remembered the gasoline canister. The lawsuits, the harassment, and the endless attempts to destroy other people's peace. Things escalated again when Karen decided to take aim at the HOA directly. Even though she had been removed as president, she still showed up at board meetings, screaming from the back of the room, trying to assert authority she no longer had. At one meeting, she brought a stack of binders filled with evidence she claimed proved everyone else was violating rules. The binders contained nothing but blurry photos and nonsense notes. When the board refused to acknowledge her, she threw one of the binders across the room and stormed out. That incident finally pushed the board to file a restraining order against her, barring her from attending meetings altogether. With every door closing on her, Karen grew more reckless. She stopped maintaining what was left of her property, and it became an eyesore. Overgrown weeds climbed up the walls, and piles of junk littered the yard. The city eventually cited her for code violations, but she ignored those too. It was as if she wanted everyone to suffer by letting her house rot in the middle of an otherwise well-kept neighborhood. Some neighbors started petitioning the city to force a sale or take the property into receivership, arguing that it was dragging down property values. The breaking point came one stormy night. Heavy rain lashed the neighborhood and wind howled through the trees. At around 2 a.m, I was jolted awake by sirens. Looking out my window, I saw fire trucks, police cars, and ambulances surrounding Karen's house. Smoke billowed into the sky, flames flickering in the dark. My first thought was arson again, but this time the fire was inside her own home. Later, investigators determined it was caused by faulty wiring, neglected repairs, and overloaded outlets. Karen had let the place fall apart so badly that it had essentially combusted from within. Neighbors gathered outside, watching in silence as firefighters battled the blaze. Karen was pulled out alive but coughing, wrapped in a blanket, and shouting at paramedics that someone must have set her house on fire. But no one believed her anymore. Her home was destroyed beyond saving. The charred remains stood as a monument to her stubbornness and downfall. The very tree she had cut without permission had taken down her roof once, and now her own negligence finished the job. In the weeks that followed, Karen's presence in the neighborhood dwindled. She was forced to move into a small rental on the edge of town, while legal battles continued. Her house was eventually condemned and fenced off. For the first time in years, the neighborhood felt free. People hosted block parties. Kids played outside without parents worrying about Karen issuing complaints, and holiday decorations appeared in abundance. The air was lighter, but even in her absence, Karen's shadow lingered. Every so often, I'd see her car drive slowly through the neighborhood, her eyes scanning the houses she once lorded over. It was a chilling reminder that she hadn't completely let go. She was no longer in control, but she still carried bitterness like a second skin. Each time she passed, I wondered what was next, whether she'd finally fade away, or whether she'd make one last desperate move to reclaim the power she had lost. The oak stump remained in my yard, weathered and cracked, but still standing as a symbol. People often pointed it out, saying how ironic it was that her attempt to assert control over my property had been the beginning of her end. And as much as I hated looking at it, I left it there because it told the story better than I ever could. A story of arrogance, consequences, and how one woman's obsession with control ultimately destroyed her. Even with Karen's house condemned and her forced out of the neighborhood, none of us truly felt the story was over, because Karen was not the type to simply disappear into silence. And sure enough, we were proven right within a month of the fire. Rumors began to circulate that she was filing lawsuits again, this time not just against me or the HOA board, but against the city itself, claiming they were conspiring to destroy her life and property. Some neighbors laughed at it, saying the courts would dismiss her rants in a heartbeat. But I had learned long ago not to underestimate her persistence. Even when she was beaten down, Karen always managed to crawl back with some new scheme or grievance. I could see the strain beginning to show on her, though. Each court date drained more of her resources, and word had spread that she was selling off furniture and personal items just to cover legal costs. What had once been a woman obsessed with controlling others had now become a woman barely able to control her own crumbling life. But that didn't stop her claws from reaching for us. One day, while I was repairing part of my fence that had blown down in a storm, I heard a car pull up behind me. It was Karen. She rolled down her window. The look in her eyes was no longer fiery determination, but something colder, emptier, as if she had nothing left to lose. "You think you won," she said, her voice trembling but sharp. "But I'm not done. You took everything from me. My house, my reputation, my HOA. You'll regret this." Before I could respond, she drove off, tires screeching as she sped away. I stood there with the hammer still in my hand, realizing that the war wasn't finished. Karen would cling to her vendetta until the very last shred of her strength was gone. Neighbors started documenting everything more carefully. Extra security cameras went up, motion lights were installed, and we all agreed to report anything suspicious immediately. For a while, there were strange occurrences again. Trash bins knocked over, car tires slashed, even George's garden vandalized with salt poured over his plants. The police were notified each time, but unless someone caught her in the act, it was hard to prove. Still, the pattern was familiar. It was Karen-style small acts of sabotage meant to send a message. She wanted us to feel unsafe, to remind us that she was still out there. I'll never forget the night she finally went too far again. Around midnight, I was woken by my phone buzzing. It was Maria, panicked. "Check your camera feed right now," she whispered. I opened my app and watched in disbelief as Karen crept into my yard, carrying what looked like a gas can. She crouched near the stump of the old oak tree, the very one she had cut down, and began pouring liquid around it. My stomach dropped as I realized she was about to set fire to the stump, maybe even my house. Without hesitation, I dialed 911 while simultaneously shouting through my outdoor speakers connected to the security system. "Karen, you're on camera. The police are on their way." She froze, whipping her head around like a cornered animal, then bolted, leaving the can behind. Within minutes, the police arrived, and this time, the evidence was undeniable. They arrested her again, and the sight of her being dragged away in handcuffs, screaming that she was the real victim, was something none of us would forget. It was the turning point. This wasn't just harassment anymore. This was a clear threat to life and property, and the courts couldn't ignore it. At her next hearing, the judge denied her bail. The prosecution laid out her entire history of escalating behavior, cutting down my tree, damaging her own home in the process, vandalizing neighbors' property, attempted arson of my house, and finally her latest stunt with the gasoline can. One by one, witnesses came forward, each neighbor telling their story of how Karen had tormented them. Sitting there in the courtroom, I realized just how much collective damage she had inflicted over the years. It wasn't just me, she had spread misery like poison throughout the entire community. The judge listened carefully. And when Karen tried to interrupt with one of her trademark rants about conspiracies, the judge ordered her silenced. The trial stretched on for weeks, and during that time, the neighborhood experienced something it hadn't in years: peace. Without Karen lurking around, the streets felt calmer. Kids rode their bikes without being yelled at. Neighbors chatted in their driveways without fear of being photographed and fined, and block parties returned. The sense of community that Karen had smothered with her iron fist was slowly coming back to life. People planted flowers, put up decorations, and even repainted fences that had long been neglected. It was as though the whole neighborhood had been holding its breath, and now we were finally able to exhale. Meanwhile, Karen sat in jail awaiting her fate. Reports surfaced that her mental state was deteriorating. Guards claimed she screamed at night, accusing them of working with the HOA to ruin her. Her fellow inmates avoided her because of her constant rants. The woman who once strutted through our neighborhood with pride and control had become a shadow of herself. isolated and despised even in confinement. When the verdict finally came, it was a mix of relief and sadness. She was found guilty of multiple counts: attempted arson, destruction of property, trespassing, and harassment. The judge sentenced her to several years in prison, citing her as a danger to society. The day she was led away in shackles, her hair disheveled, and her face twisted in fury, a hush fell over the courtroom. Neighbors who had attended the trial exchanged glances, some nodding, others wiping away tears of relief. I sat there, heart pounding, realizing it was over, truly over this time. Karen was gone, and with her departure, the neighborhood had a chance to heal. In the aftermath, there was a collective effort to restore what she had destroyed. The HOA, now led by a new and much more reasonable board, organized community projects. We repaired fences, replanted gardens, and held events to bring neighbors closer together. For the first time in years, we felt like a real community, united not by fear, but by resilience. The stump of the oak tree was eventually removed, not because I wanted to erase the memory, but because it was time to move forward. In its place, I planted a new sapling, a small oak that would one day grow tall and strong. Neighbors helped me plant it, and as we stood around it, someone said, "This is our new beginning." Karen's house, now condemned and burned out, was eventually torn down. The lot was sold, and a new family moved in, completely unaware of the dark history that had unfolded there. I considered telling them the full story, but decided against it. They deserved a fresh start without the weight of Karen's legacy. All I hoped was that the land itself had been cleansed of her bitterness. As for me, I learned a lot through the ordeal. At times, I had wanted to give up, to sell my house, and escape the nightmare Karen had created. But standing my ground had proven worthwhile. The neighborhood was stronger now because of what we endured. Karen had tried to divide and control us, but in the end, she only united us against her tyranny. Even now, there are moments when I think about her. I wonder what she's doing in prison, whether she's plotting revenge or finally realizing the cost of her obsession. Part of me feels pity because no one should waste their life consumed by control and hate, but another part of me feels nothing but relief that she's no longer free to terrorize anyone. And so, the story of the oak tree came full circle. Karen cut it down to assert her power, but in doing so, she set in motion the events that led to her downfall. The tree may have fallen, but its spirit lived on in the strength of the community it helped forge. And as the new oak sapling grew in its place, so too did hope, resilience, and the promise that we would never again allow someone like Karen to control our lives. Months after Karen's sentencing, the neighborhood settled into a rhythm we hadn't known in years. It was strange, almost unsettling at first, to realize how quiet things had become without her constant interference. No more anonymous complaint letters taped to doors. No more sudden HOA emergency meetings called to shame a family for leaving their trash bins out too long. No more screaming matches in the middle of the street over imagined slights. The peace felt fragile, like something that could break at any moment, and many of us half expected her to reappear out of nowhere, storming back with some new claim of authority. But the weeks turned into months, and life truly began to bloom again. My new oak sapling grew strong, its green leaves stretching upward as though to declare victory over the past. And neighbors began stopping by just to admire it. They called it the Freedom Tree, a symbol of how far we had come. Yet even as calm returned, Karen's shadow lingered in small ways. At neighborhood gatherings, her name would slip into conversation, always with a mixture of disbelief and bitterness. People recalled how she had bullied them into repainting fences, forced absurd HOA fines, and in my case, cut down the tree that had stood for generations, only to watch it crush her own home. It became the story everyone told, new neighbors half warning, half legend. Parents used it to caution their children about arrogance. Don't be a Karen, or you'll end up like the woman whose house fell because of her own greed. The tale had taken on a life of its own. It's a parable of poetic justice. I thought I had made peace with it all, but life has a way of testing that. One evening, I received an anonymous letter in the mail. It had no return address, just my name scrawled in sharp handwriting. Inside, a single line was written. "This isn't over." My heart skipped. because though the words were vague, I could almost hear Karen's voice behind them. I turned it over to the police, but without proof, they couldn't do much. For a few weeks, I slept uneasily, double-checking my locks and making sure the cameras were always on. But the letter turned out to be nothing more than a final ghost. A last ripple of fear from someone who no longer had any real power over us. When no other threats followed, I allowed myself to breathe again. The longer Karen remained behind bars, the more our community flourished. We repainted the HOA office, which had been left in disarray after her departure, and turned it into a small community center where families gathered for weekend potlucks and holiday celebrations. The energy was different now, filled with laughter and connection rather than suspicion. Children who had once been scolded for riding scooters on the sidewalk now raced freely down the street, their joy uncontained. Couples planted flowers in their front yards without fear of being fined for using the wrong shade. Even George, who had once nearly moved away because of Karen's constant harassment over his garden, now proudly showed off his tomatoes and sunflowers, finally free to enjoy them without interference. As the neighborhood rebuilt itself, I rebuilt a part of myself too. I had carried anger for so long, anger at the loss of my tree, at Karen's endless harassment, at the sleepless nights she caused. But over time, I realized that holding on to that anger only gave her a permanent place in my life. I didn't want that. I wanted freedom not just from her actions, but from the grip she had on my emotions. Planting the new oak tree had been a first step, but forgiveness, even if only for my own sake, was the next. Forgiveness didn't mean excusing what she had done. It meant refusing to let her dictate how I felt anymore. And as strange as it sounded, I began to feel pity for her, locked away, consumed by the very bitterness she had tried to spread. Then came the day of her final downfall. I heard about it from a neighbor who followed the local news more closely than I did. Karen, who had continued filing motions and appeals even from prison, had finally been declared a vexatious litigant by the court. That meant she could no longer file lawsuits without special permission, effectively cutting off her last weapon. When I read the article for myself, I felt a wave of finality wash over me. This was it. The war was done. She could scream, rant, and blame all she wanted. But her days of controlling others with paperwork and intimidation were over. She had lost everything: her home, her reputation, her community, and now even her voice in the courts. The neighborhood marked the occasion in our own quiet way. At the next community gathering, we raised a toast, not to Karen's misery, but to our own resilience. To the tree that fell, someone said, holding up a glass. And to the tree that grew in its place. Laughter and applause followed. For the first time, I felt like the wound had truly closed. The new oak tree swayed gently in the breeze, its leaves catching the sunlight, and I smiled knowing it would outlive all of us. A reminder of what we had endured and what we had overcome. Still, the story didn't just fade. Word spread beyond our neighborhood, and soon journalists were calling. Curious about the bizarre saga of the HOA president who cut down her neighbor's tree only to have it fall on her own house, sparking a chain of events that ended with her imprisonment. At first, I declined to comment, not wanting to stir up old wounds. But eventually I realized that telling the story wasn't about reliving the pain. It was about sharing a lesson. So, I gave one interview. I told them about the importance of standing up for yourself, for not letting bullies, whether they're neighbors, HOA leaders, or anyone else, dictate your life. I explained how Karen's downfall wasn't just about karma, but about a community coming together to resist injustice. The article went viral, and suddenly our little neighborhood became a cautionary tale told across the internet. With time, I realized that Karen's actions had left me with something unexpected: perspective. I had seen how far entitlement and obsession could drive someone, but I had also seen how far resilience and unity could carry us. I had learned the value of boundaries, literal and figurative, and the importance of protecting what is yours without stooping to the level of those who seek to tear it away. Most of all, I had learned that justice doesn't always come quickly. But when it does, it comes with a weight that cannot be denied. On the anniversary of the day Karen cut down my tree, I stood beside the new oak. Now several feet taller, its trunk growing thicker, its roots firmly gripping the earth. I placed my hand on the bark and thought about everything that had happened. The fear, the anger, the battles, the trials, they were part of the past now. What mattered was the future, the life that continued to grow even after so much had been destroyed. As the sun set behind it, painting the sky in shades of orange and gold, I whispered quietly to myself, "We made it." And if there's one thing I hope anyone takes from this story, it's this: never let someone else's bitterness dictate your joy. Stand your ground, protect what's yours, and trust that, in the end, the truth has a way of revealing itself, even if it takes time. Karen thought she could control everything, but in the end, it was her own arrogance that destroyed her. My tree may have fallen, but our community rose higher than ever before. And that's the legacy that will remain long after Karen's name is forgotten. So if you've been following this story, let this be your reminder. Always fight for your rights. Never let bullies win, and cherish the strength of unity. And if you want more stories of justice, revenge, and unexpected twists, just like this one, make sure to subscribe to Sham Stories, because you won't want to miss what's coming next.